So here at CaringKind, we consider our helpline the hub of our programs and services. It's often the first point of contact for people living with dementia and their care partners. So our helpline is here to offer information about dementia and about providing care for a person with dementia, and also to connect you to many of the local resources here in New York City and beyond. For people who need a little bit more emotional support or more planning, we have dementia consultation. We also have many education programs, such as our monthly education meeting. We have an Understanding Dementia meeting, which gives you an overview of dementia and our programs. We have a legal and financial meeting, and we have a Medicaid home care meeting, which walks you through the steps of applying for home care. And this monthly education meeting introduces you to a host of new topics. And you can find all this information on our website, CaringKindNYC.org, or you can call our helpline at any time, 646-744-2900. We also offer professional education, such as our Understanding Dementia for Professionals. And we're proud to relaunch our early stage services. Right now, we're doing an evidence-based program for people at the early stage that is both cognitively and socially engaging. So if you know someone who is appropriate for the program, or you're interested in the program in general, please call our helpline to find out more. We have approximately 90 support groups throughout New York City, ranging from, we have spousal groups, we have groups for people who are children of people living with dementia. We have specialty groups for different cultural communities, and we have some general groups that they're good for everyone. And most of them are being offered virtually now, though we do plan to go in person with at least some of them in the near future. We have a Medical Alert New York City Wanderer Safety Program. It's been shown that about 2/3 of people with dementia will wander at some point. So we offer education and training to first responders on what to do if they find someone who they believe has dementia and is wandering. And we try to connect people with a medical alert program, which provides an identification bracelet for a person living with dementia, so they can be easily reunited with their families if they wander. We have an online resource called Together We Care for people who are searching for private home care aides. We have a program called Connect to Culture, which allows us to train cultural organizations on how to work with people with dementia, and we also guide them in developing programs for people with dementia. And we're also hosting programs here at CaringKind, bringing in the arts to offer these engaging programs. We have a number of outreach initiatives to provide information and awareness in the community. And we also do a lot of palliative and residential care consultation to organizations. Finally, we have a new program called MAP that pairs a person who was a former care partner with a person living with dementia and their care partner, and helps guide them through, especially those early stages of the disease when a person is first diagnosed and they're looking for a place to turn and for information. So please, if you want any information about these services, please visit our website, CaringKindNYC.org, or call our helpline, 646-744-2900. So I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules before introducing our guest tonight. So my name is Ed Chisek. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at CaringKind. I've been here for about 12 years. And we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Weinberg. Again, this is a very interesting topic that I'm very excited to learn more about. There's a lot of new work in this area. If possible, please keep your cameras on. Like I said before, though, remember we are being recorded. Please stay muted and post your questions in the chat. We're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. We're going to leave a lot of time at the end of the talk to answer some of those questions. If you're not logged on with your name, if you're not logged on with a phone number or an alias, please consider changing your name to at least your first name and maybe last initial, so that we know who's on with us tonight. We'll be sending a copy of the slides tomorrow, along with a feedback survey. So we need to know who's participating tonight so we can get that information out to you. We'd love to hear what you think about the presentation tonight. Finally, please consider joining us in one of our walks. We have 2 this year. This is the biggest fundraising and awareness events that we have. We rely on private support for most of our funding. We get very little government support. So walks are very important to us. They are free to register. You can register for free. It's a great way to show your support for the dementia community, honor a person with dementia or care partners. And it's a lot of fun. Our sites this year are Coney Island on September 25th and Central Park on October 23rd. So there'll be lots of fun, kids, dogs. We'll have lots of sponsor tables. We usually are blessed with good weather on those days, so please try to make it out. If you can't make it out, please consider supporting someone who is walking. And you can visit our walk page at CaringKindNYC.org/walk. And I posted that information in the chat as well. And Dr. Weinberg himself is going to try to make at least one of the walks, so maybe you can get to meet him in person and take a stroll with him. Okay, so on to the presenter. So I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Weinberg. He is the founder and chief medical officer of Cannabis Doctors of New York. He is a 3-time board-certified emergency medicine and medical marijuana physician. After finishing a residency in internal medicine, Dr. Weinberg created a fellowship in psychoneuroimmunology at the Manhattan VA, then trained in emergency medicine at Bellevue and NYU Langone Hospital. He has practiced emergency and urgent care medicine for over 3 decades. When New York State's Compassionate Care Act was passed in January of 2016, he founded Cannabis Doctors of New York. The practice, which is based in New York City and upstate, certifies patients, educates the public, and advocates for the many benefits of medical marijuana. The advocacy, education, as well as cannabis research are also carried out in his role as a member of the Medicinal Cannabis Work Group at Northwell Health. Dr. Weinberg has treated over 1,000 patients with diseases across a spectrum of conditions. He is a cannabis advocate and an emerging thought leader who has lectured on the benefits of cannabis throughout the state, met with elected officials to promote its use, and has been featured in various publications and on television. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kenneth Weinberg.
I wanted to thank Ed and also Eleanor Tornator-McKesh for doing this, for making this possible. I met Eleanor at Inspire, which is an adult senior living facility that just opened recently, and which I'll talk more about later. But it was so great to meet her and her excitement when she found out that I was a cannabis doctor, and she immediately wanted me to do this talk. So I've been really looking forward to doing this since then. That was this summer. I'll just fill in a few gaps. Ed, thank you for what you said about my background. Yeah, I did a residency in internal medicine, but I was always interested in mind-body interactions. And my friend was the head of the Department of Psychiatry at the Manhattan VA. I had done some work with him when I was a medical student. So he said, oh, you know what? Come back to New York and do a fellowship in psychoneuroimmunology, which was very exciting to me. And I started working on a bunch of projects, the most prominent of which was I spent about 7 months getting a project going to treat AIDS patients with acupuncture. And this was in 1983, 1984, when at a time when being diagnosed with AIDS was basically a death sentence. And every patient I went to sign up was delighted to. We were going to be using sterile, non-reusable acupuncture needles. What was the harm? Well, it turned out that the head of the Department of Medicine put the kibosh on the study. He said, I don't want the VA to be known as a place that practices voodoo medicine. And my friend was not supportive of me, and I realized I had to quit. I couldn't stay in this job. What was I going to do? I had worked in the emergency room at Bellevue, at LA County, and also when I had moonlit in the ER at the Manhattan VA, and I knew that Louis Goldfrank, who was then the head of the Department of Emergency Medicine at Bellevue and NYU, was looking for docs. I didn't know that I would make a career of it, but 30 plus years later, I did. That's what happened. And it's funny, when Ed was talking about wandering, I just thought about it. I've written a lot of stories during my time as an ER doc. And the first one I ever wrote was about a patient who was brought in the middle of the night, wandering. He was somewhere in Queens. He was awake and alert, had no idea where he was, what had happened. He only spoke Russian. Then it turned out that we were able to converse in Spanish. I somehow was able to figure out his name, and right as he was being admitted to the hospital, I reached his daughter. I had the phone book from, this was in the 80s, and as he was being taken off to a floor, I saw his daughter reunited with him, and that was pretty amazing. I don't know what his ultimate diagnosis was, but anyway, so I from Bellevue, I had a career, as I said, for 30 years in emergency medicine, and then started Cannabis Doctors, and have seen well over 1,000 patients, and increasingly I've been seeing patients with dementia, and again, through Inspire, have been seeing and really being able to direct treatment for these patients with dementia. So I'm very excited to give this talk right now about what I've been seeing and what's the research that's been going on with Alzheimer's and cannabis. But I felt like I should talk a little bit about Alzheimer's. I was actually surprised to see that it was such a prevalent disease. I think it's probably much more than 50 million people worldwide, with 60 to 80% of them actually having the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And unfortunately, also, I think it's on the rise. There's a lot of overlap, obviously, between just dementia and Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's being one of the dementias. But I just wanted to mention this as well, because I think all of the dementias ultimately wind up having deterioration in the parts of the brain that are involved with memory and learning and cognition. And so they share a lot of similarities, and obviously treatments can be directed towards these issues that go on with them. And I think it's really important here, excuse me, because I may be clearing my throat. I apologize. I have a little bit of a sore throat, but nothing serious going on. So anyway, I think what's important, especially with Alzheimer's, I think for people, we have learned that when a diagnosis of Alzheimer's is finally made, people have actually been having the process go on for 25 to 30 years. So I think, to me, that means that any of these components that are involved, if people know that they have them, they really need to, especially the genetic, I think they really need to be thinking about starting treatments as early as possible, certainly in middle age. What I hope I will be able to show now is that I think that cannabis should be among those early treatment, disease-modifying treatments, which I'll talk about in a moment. I think it should be one of the first ones that's being used when people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So again, this obviously the most important things that we see, the behavioral problems. What's interesting to me also here is that one of the first things that happens to people is they lose their sense of smell. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, and its possible role in dementia, and possibly some ways of treating dementia with that olfactory nerve. So right now, there are 3 ways that are looked at for treatment options for Alzheimer's. There's neuropsychiatric treatments, there are the symptomatic treatments, and there are disease-modifying treatments. Of the management of this neuropsychiatric symptoms, SSRIs, serotonin, we know the serotonin pathways in the brain are very involved with mood, and obviously Alzheimer's has a significant component of depression. So I think drugs like Zoloft are probably very helpful and make a lot of sense as part of the treatment options. I have a lot of issues, though, having been an ER doctor, especially with the antipsychotic medicines. And when I worked on the psych ward as well, Seroquel, Haldol, medicines like that, I understand that sometimes we have to really work hard to control the behavior of patients, but Seroquel and Haldol and those kinds of medications have black box warnings. They're potentially very dangerous. In some cases, they lead to death. And they also just put up a bigger screen, loss of interaction between patients and caregivers and families. So I have issues with those medicines. It's just my personal opinion about it. Symptomatic treatments, acetylcholine. The choline system is very involved with cognition. This is another neurotransmitter system in the brain. Acetylcholinesterase, long word, but basically cholinesterase it breaks down acetylcholine. So what you want to do, because we know that the levels of acetylcholine are going down in Alzheimer's, drugs like Aricept attempt to keep that acetylcholine levels higher, which may or may not be helpful and with the disease. And now the most exciting, which is the next one, Danny, are the disease modifying and monoclonal antibodies. I have to say that Aduhelm, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, was just approved by the FDA last June for an accelerated approval. So there's a lot of excitement with that. What I would like to make the case for is that medical cannabis should also be looked at, not only as disease modifying, but it also deals with acetylcholine, and it deals with many of the neuropsychiatric issues with treatment. So I am hoping to make the case that it should be a first-line drug. And again, we just listed some of the different, or pictured here, some of the different forms of ingestion, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. You can go on to the next. When I came across this statement, I thought I really had to include it because it really, I think, is at the heart of dementia. And as we lose our memory, we lose our personhood. And I just think memory loss erases who we are, really says it all. And I just wanted to put it up there for, I'm sure a lot of people have seen it in the past, but anyway. Okay, now let's talk about cannabis. I think it's important because at this point, I think we're really entering an era where a lot of the stigma around cannabis are being erased, and which is very exciting to me. But I think it's important to know that before it was stigmatized, it had been around for 12,000 years, maybe. I think we have evolved with the plant. If you look any animals that have vertebral columns, that have spinal cords, have endocannabinoid systems. We make our own cannabis. I think it's just important to understand how important it has been throughout history And I'll talk about that now. I think you could go on to the next slide, Jenny. One of the things that I was struck by was Carl Sagan, who I'm sure everybody knows, who is a major advocate for cannabis, says that he believes that cannabis actually brought us from being hunter-gatherers to agrarian agricultural societies. When ancient people started to see all of the benefits that the plant provided, they realized they couldn't be going from here to there on the plains or wherever they were. They needed to stay in one place. They needed to be able to grow the plant, to be able to harvest it, to be able to take care of it. And it brought us into that kind of society. Is that true? We'll never know. But I like the story. And just a couple of other things that we show here about, I think another thing just to mention at the bottom was that nobody ever knew why cannabis worked, what was in it. And Raphael Mechoulam, who's still around, amazing guy, a Israeli researcher in 1964, isolated THC and discovered that that was the major psychoactive component of the plant. It took another 30 years for us to see that we actually had receptors. As I will mention, the master system, there are more endocannabinoid receptors in the brain than any other neurotransmitter. And then we discovered not long after that, that we actually make our own cannabis, endocannabis, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so here's the plant, cannabis plant. It actually, I think people oftentimes wonder, is there a difference between hemp and cannabis? And there really isn't, other than this artificial legal determination that hemp has less than 0.3% THC in it. But if you were to look at the plants, you wouldn't see very much difference at all. So the different properties of the plants, what's funny is if you look at the roots and joint inflammation and you look at history, Pliny the Elder, who was a 1st century AD Roman statesman and naturalist, talks about the fact that even then they knew that the roots were good for joint inflammation. Looking at the seeds, they have so many different uses, even today, food, paint, varnishes. Then we move on to the stems. Recently, the stems have been used a lot for building materials, for insulation. But if you go back throughout history, the stems of cannabis have been used for sails, for rope. In fact, you can find some very interesting, funny films from the 1940s of hemp rope being used for the war, and it was a very, and still remains, a great product. The problem is that around that same time, actually in the 30s, DuPont had just produced nylon. They came out with nylon. Nylon, they were making nylon rope. They saw themselves, excuse me, in competition with hemp rope. At the same time, William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper baron, had vast tracts of forests, which he wanted to take for the pulp for newspapers. It turns out that hemp was also more efficient to be used for, and you weren't destroying forests. So he immediately saw it as the enemy as well. And then the third part of this is that Harry J. Anslinger, who was the first head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and actually was related to some of the DuPonts, was appointed, and they started a campaign against cannabis. It was the first time that they started using the term marijuana, obviously to associate it with people of color, to demonize it, just like other politicians we know of today who are doing the same kind of thing. And it had been, up until this time, it was in the US pharmacopoeia as a legitimate substance. It was taken off that at that point. At the same time, the movie that I'm sure a lot of you have seen, Reefer Madness, came out. I think it's one of the best propaganda, not best, but one of the most effective propaganda films of all time. People still think about it. The behavior that was exhibited in that film, people look at and they think, oh, killer weed. And the irony is that in 5,000 years that we know about, no one has ever died of an overdose of cannabis. Be that as it may. The leaves have been used for paper, for juicing. In fact, the parchment that our Declaration of Independence was written on was hemp parchment. And then the last part of the plant, and most exciting for many of us, are the flowers. Medicinal qualities. Again, I talked about how this was taken off the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. I mean, I have bottles, pictures of bottles from Park Davis from the turn of the century, where cannabis was an integral part of so many different medications. But when they made when they took it off the Pharmacopoeia, it no longer could be used. And if we move now into the 50s or 60s, when people of my generation were starting to use cannabis, discover cannabis, Richard Nixon was president. He was very distressed at cannabis, or roofer, as I think he called it, and it was still illegal. He appointed a commission. William Schaefer was the governor of Pennsylvania, and they made a Schaefer commission. Nixon was sure that they were going to recommend that it remained illegal. This was at the same time that the DEA came into power, and they were making scheduling of different drugs. Much to his chagrin, to Nixon's chagrin, Schaefer said, no, I think we should make it legal. And the next thing we know, cannabis was put on as a Schedule I narcotic. It was listed as a Schedule I narcotic, which means that basically it has no medical benefits and has a high addictive potential to it. Totally bogus. It's really unfortunate. I will just say, having been an emergency medicine doc for 30 plus years, if you came to me, I could prescribe cocaine for you. I could prescribe amphetamine for you. I could prescribe any of the synthetic or natural opioids. I can't prescribe medical cannabis. And in fact, the way the program works in New York is that if someone comes to me and I determine that they should get medical cannabis, I will give them a certification, but the actual prescription is given to them when they go to one of the pharmacists who work at the dispensaries. And I'll mention more about this later, but I think that's one of the best things about the New York program, that when you go in, before you get any product, you have a long consultation with very well-informed pharmacists in the different dispensaries. Just going back now, I think it's also important to recognize that cannabis has been around forever for its spiritual properties. There are things that say that in the Torah, God told the priests that when they, at the time of the building of the first temple, that they should be anointed with an oil made of canna bosom. Is that cannabis? We'll never know. But I do know that a few years ago, the BBC had a documentary, and they went to the second temple and they found residue of different products of cannabis. They found THC, CBG, CBD. Again, I think it's provocative. I don't know how true it is, but I think it's interesting to know that there are these references. And then the third part is the pleasure. I think certainly in the 60s, that was a lot of what it was used for, but I think we can be using it now for pleasure. I think certainly the elderly patients I see, I just had a patient I was requested to see who is 86. She wanted to use it because it really helps her and her husband have sex. I think so. I think we should accept and appreciate the fact that of all of these different aspects of the plant, all that it can do for us. So the plant has so many different compounds in it that are active. Obviously, the cannabinoids, and I'll show in a moment what the difference between the different cannabinoids, but I also just want to talk about terpenes. Anybody who's ever smelled cannabis knows that it has very distinct odors to it. And that's from the terpenes. Terpenes are compounds like pinene. If you walk through a pine forest, that's what you're smelling. It's used for pine salt. Limonene comes from the lemon plant. But these are very important parts of the plant that really modify and augment a lot of what the cannabinoids do. And there's some thought that they may actually be helpful because, again, think about dementia, you lose your sense of smell, the smell goes through the olfactory nerve. There is some research that I've seen that shows that terpenes may be helpful for dementia. So I just want to show, I'm not going to have a quiz about what the structure of CBD and THC are for anybody, but all of the different cannabinoids, I think two things that are interesting about it are that they all are very, very similar. There's almost no difference between CBD and THC, except at the very bottom, there's an OH instead of an O. All of the different cannabinoids have just minor changes on them, and yet those minor chemical changes lead to very different effects. The other thing of interest is if you look, there's this CH3 tail at the end. The cannabinoids that we make in our own brain are very similar to that, and I think that's the reason why when we take cannabis from a plant, it goes so easily to all those receptors in our brain. So again, the endocannabinoid system, we just discovered it in the last 20 to 30 years, but it is the master system. It's involved with so many different processes. And it's why cannabis works, and it's why it does so well for us. There are two different receptors, CB1, CB2. It doesn't really matter that much, but we actually make our own cannabis. And I think that's what's really important. And when we take cannabis, it goes to those receptors and increases the transmission among the different receptors. The other thing that's important to know is that the majority, even though this is the most extensive system of neuroreceptors in the brain, the three main places where it is found are, again, in the olfactory bulb. The cranial nerve 1 has a huge number of endocannabinoid receptors, as do the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are the main areas in the brain that are involved with memory. So I think it's important to look at this. Again, I think people who are involved with Alzheimer's are very aware of all of these different degenerative processes that cause Alzheimer's, the amyloid, which causes plaques, the hyperphosphorylated tau fibrils, all of which cause neuroinflammation, loss of neurons. Microglia are the scavenger cells in the brain. They cause more inflammation, and ultimately there's death of brain cells, and mostly in the areas involved with cognition and memory. The other thing is, as I've mentioned before, there's a decrease in acetylcholine, which is that important neurotransmitter involved with cognition. Okay. Again, the areas that are most affected, the frontal lobe, which we know deals with executive function. And I think that's really the reason why there are so many behavioral issues that Alzheimer's patients have. They no longer have those inhibitory executive functions that allow them to tamp down any impulses they may feel, especially from the anxiety that they get, knowing as the disease process is inexorably proceeding, there's a lot of anxiety that goes on. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And then the hippocampus and the limbic system are also affected with memory. Okay, so I'm going to show some, in a minute, I will show some research papers that are out there, but I just wanted to show, again, acetylcholine. It turns out THC is the strongest known inhibitor of acetylcholine. It also, in the lab, shows that it prevents the development of those neurofibrillary tangles. And again, I think I can make the case, I hopefully, or people need to think about, as soon as somebody knows that they may have an issue with the development of Alzheimer's in middle age, maybe you should start using cannabis. It's a benign drug, as I'm saying, and I think it may be able to prevent the development of the disease. CBD is neuroprotective. There have been a bunch of studies in Israel and other places, and I reference one of them here. Great neuroprotective effect. It's an amazing anti-inflammatory. I have a number of patients with autoimmune diseases where inflammation is the root of it, and CBD is great for preventing that or dampening that down. And again, it's a great anxiolytic, anxiety. As I was saying before, I think a lot of what happens with patients with Alzheimer's, they develop anxiety. And I think that causes the behavioral issues, but I think it also causes what seem to be cognitive issues. And I've been thinking about this as I've been seeing Alzheimer's patients, that I know myself, for any of us, anxiety really decreases our ability to access people's names, other memories. So if it happens to us, you can imagine that the anxiety that Alzheimer's patients are feeling, it's really showing itself as cognitive impairment when there may not be some. And I've seen cognitive improvement, and I think part of it is for many reasons, but one of them is because it's really helping with the anxiety. And then there's a whole issue about neurogenesis, plasticity. Is it possible to regenerate parts of the brain? Again, it's very early on, but it's really titillating kinds of information to think about. And again, going back to the Schedule 1 thing, it is so difficult to do research with this, and I'll talk more about this in a moment. So in this country, we aren't really able to look at this very well. And we have something that potentially has great promise in so many places, and yet we're hampered as physicians in researching it. Okay, go ahead. So here are some studies. There are so many. If you go to PubMed, which is where I generally go, there's a plethora of studies, but this is one. The first two are mouse studies, and this type of mouse actually has the same or very similar pathological neurodegenerative processes that occur in Alzheimer's. And what they found in this study was that CBD had a very strong antioxidant effect. It provides neuroprotection, reduced oxidative damage. It also could reduce that beta amyloid cell damage and increasing cell survival. So in addition, these mice actually showed impaired social recognition memory and object recognition memory. And it turns out that CBD was actually able to improve that. Okay, the next one. Now, this is actually ischemia, which means lack of blood flow, was actually induced in these mice. But again, ischemia, this like multi-infarct dementia, ischemia is involved in so many of the dementias that I thought it was important to show this study. And they use short-term CBD treatment. They found that it prevented the cognitive and emotional impairment. Remember the hippocampus, it protected the hippocampal structures after an ischemic event, and it stimulated neurogenesis. In other words, new growth of new nerve cells. The dendrites, which are the structures in the hippocampus, were also, it promoted their restructuring. And so what they felt was that the results show that short-term CBD treatment results in global functional recovery, impacts multiple and distinct targets involved in the pathophysiology of brain ischemic injury. Now, the next one was actually from Canada, and this is a review of multiple studies. The first one showed that after 28 days of treatment with a cannabis oil, it was effective for treating the agitation, disinhibition, irritability, aberrant motor behavior, and nocturnal behavior disorders, as well as aberrant vocalization and resting care, which are seen with dementia. And they looked at a mini mental status exam, and they showed some limited, but some evidence of improvement in rigidity and cognitive scores. Another study showed that to a statistically significant extent, caregiver burden was reduced. Also, another study showed there was a significant improvement in aberrant vocalization, motor agitation, aggressiveness, and resting care. So this was after treatment with about a 17-day treatment with cannabis. Next study. This was a Swiss-based study. This looked at 10 demented female patients with severe behavioral disorders. They got an oral THC CBD oil, and they used a neuropsychiatric inventory, which is the Cohen-Mansfield Agitation Inventory Score, and looked at behavioral problems via visual analog scale. And they showed a decrease in these issues after 2 months. Rigidity score in these patients was reduced by 50%. Half of the patients stopped taking their other psychiatric or decreased or stopped taking their other psychotropic meds. The staff appreciated the decrease in rigidity. It made daily care and transfers easier and helped with direct contact with the patients, the improvement in behavior, and they also found a decrease in constipation because these patients were using less opioids for pain. Finally, there was no withholding of the medication for reasons of side effects. And these effects persisted for 2 months. And the next one, looking at safety. So this looked a little bit of the efficacy of observational studies, which showed promising results. But what they really found was that there was a very favorable safety profile, which we see all the time with cannabis. The safety window for cannabis is very wide. I mean, you have to be careful, and that's one of the reasons why I really like the New York program, because we are working with pharmacists all the time. But in this study, they found that there were minimal adverse events, and they were mild. And this shows what happens when you don't call this a Schedule I narcotic. I just wanted to mention previously that mentioned something else about the Schedule I issue. Okay. I have 2 friends who were doing research in PTSD. And it took them, they were able to get a Schedule I license. It took them 3 years to get medical cannabis from, at that time, the only facility in the country, the University of Mississippi, that provided it. It was 3-year-old or 4 or 5-year-old cannabis. By the time they got it, it was moldy. Turns out also that the genetics of the cannabis from the University of Mississippi are vastly different than the genetics of the cannabis that one would get if you go into any of the states where it's medically legal. So if you're even doing research with the Mississippi product, it's like apples and oranges. How can you even compare? So I just wanted to mention that. And on the other hand, here we are in Israel. I have a friend, Timna Naftali, who's done a lot of, she's a GI doc in Tel Aviv, who's done a lot of work with inflammatory bowel disease and cannabis. And when I sent her the link to this talk, she sent me this study. So this is just recently published. They were looking at the safety and efficacy of a medical cannabis oil for reduction of behavioral disturbances among patients with dementia. They had 60 randomized patients. It was a placebo-controlled, double-blind, single-site study. And these patients, there was a mean age of 79, and 60% were women. What they found was a statistically significant difference in the proportion of subjects, again, using this Cohen-Mansfield Agitation Inventory. There was a significant reduction in that. And They also found that the treatment was mostly safe, no significant differences in the occurrence of adverse events between the two groups. So they found that it significantly reduced agitation from patients suffering with behavioral disturbances caused by dementia, no serious side effects, and they recommended further research should be done with a larger sample size, which makes a lot of sense. Now, the last study, I actually met Dr. Naftali out at Colorado State because they were having cannabis research conferences there. They're doing a tremendous amount of work in the field of cannabis research. And I found that they just got funding for this study, which is going to start next month, which is very exciting. And I've been in touch with the people there and look forward to hearing what they're finding going forward. Okay. Since I've been seeing patients at Inspire, which is the place that I mentioned before, which is an adult living facility on the Upper East Side, I've been very lucky because the people who are involved have really been very supportive. Brian Geiser is the chief medical officer there. He's a nurse practitioner, and I work with Donna Maloney, who's a head nurse there, Sang Choi, who's the head pharmacist at Etain. And because we've been seeing these patients and we've been seeing them on a regular basis, we've developed a database. And I have two other docs that I work with and I meet with on a regular basis. Lynn West, who's a cannabis doc in Westchester, and then Sherry Yafai, who's a cannabis doc in LA. We have now been accumulating a database, accruing data on all of our patients with dementia and finding the results that I'm seeing here, which, have been very exciting, very provocative, make me feel like, as we're doing at Inspire, that people should, once that diagnosis is made, we should be starting to use medical cannabis. Again, to talk a little bit more about the program, when I see patients for treatment with medical cannabis, I spend a good hour or so talking to them about it. It's not one size fits all, just like any other medicine. There's always some amount of time that's taken, whether it be a botanical medicine like cannabis or gabapentin or any other medicine, before you find what really works the best. But I find that if patients use tools like journaling, again, because the program in New York State is so precise and consistent, if somebody gets, for example, something that's 5 milligrams THC, 5 milligrams CBD, and they see, okay, it has these effects, then they know that each time they use that product, it's going to give them those same benefits. And the patients I've had have really evolved over weeks and sometimes months, a series or an array of different cannabis products for their toolkit that they know they can use when they anticipate something happening or to prevent something from happening. And again, there are really three different ways you can use the cannabis products. There are the fast-acting products like vapes and sprays and drops, which come on within a matter of a few to 20 minutes or so and last up to 4 hours. Often good ways to start because you can really titrate very quickly and see what kind of benefits you're getting with different ratios of THC and CBD, or the longer acting products. And these are the ones that you ingest, whether they're capsules or gummies or powders, because they are digested. They take sometimes up to an hour or so to give you effect, but they can last 6 or 8 hours. And then there's also topicals, which many of my patients find to be very helpful for pain, putting them in different areas where they do have, where they need relief of pain. So I guess in summary, I hope that I have really shown how helpful I think cannabis can be for the treatment in all the different aspects of Alzheimer's and dementia, I think there are a lot of places where it may well work, and we obviously need a lot more research. We need to get it off Schedule 1. It needs to be decriminalized so we can really be doing the studies here that are being done in other countries like Canada or Israel, where it's no longer on that Schedule 1. And before I end, I have to thank Danny Sondral and her husband, Greg, who put together what I thought was just a wonderful slideshow. Lauren Bishara, who is my major domo as well, who's been so helpful for this. And thank you all, and I'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinberg. We have a number of questions in the chat. First question, has the VA approved using cannabis for the veterans living in VA nursing homes?
As far as I know, they haven't. In fact, I had a patient who was a VA psychiatrist, and she stopped being able to use it because at the time they were testing all of the physicians for cannabis. So even though it helped her, she couldn't use it. As far as I know, they have not. It's so great for PTSD and so many other things. But no, as far as I know, they haven't.
Does cannabis also apply to different dementias like Lewy body or vascular dementia?
Yes, well, that's what I was trying to get at. And yes, it does, because so many of those different processes that ultimately lead to Lewy body or the dementia that seems with Parkinson's, for example, it definitely can be helpful in those for those diseases as well.
Okay. And does it seem to help with certain dementia-related behaviors more than others?
That's a great question, because I'm looking at it and seeing that it feels like so much of it is that from the interface between the anxiety and the loss of frontal lobe inhibition. I don't know. That's a very good question, and I don't have a great answer to it.
Thank you. How about interactions? Does medical cannabis have any interactions with prescription medications?
Oh, absolutely. Look, it's metabolized in the liver. And that's one of the reasons why I think I feel so good knowing that I work with pharmacists. I mean, I'm aware of a lot of the interactions, but when the patients go to the pharmacist, they're also being, making their med list available. Because it's metabolized in the liver, it can cause interactions, but it rarely does, because to cause problems with the enzymes in the liver that are breaking down or increasing the levels of certain drugs, you have to be using very high doses, especially of CBD. So generally, it is not an issue.
Great. Is medical marijuana oil for vaping harmful to the lungs?
Great question. I think the jury is still out. It's funny because it turns out that THC is a bronchodilator. So it actually can be helpful for opening up the lungs, like for asthmatics. I have not seen any hard data that shows that vaping, now we're not talking about vaping like Juul, we're talking about just an oil that is heated to a point where it becomes a vapor through a vaporizer. I've not seen any hard data that shows that it's harmful. Patients who have lung disease, lung issues, I often will steer them away from using vapes just because there are so many other ways of doing it.
One person wants to know, what's the definition of cannabinoid?
Right. So it is a specific group of chemicals, and I don't know if you can go back to that slide, but they are 3-ring structures with a tail on them, and all of them, again, and they're very specific if you look at them, and all of them have that same basic structure, and they only vary by 1 or 2 compounds, like a hydrogen ion or an oxygen or an OH. So 3 rings, that long tail with the CH3 on the end, but there's very little difference among them. and there's over 100 cannabinoids in the plant. We discover more and more all the time. The difference in that one chemical can make the one cannabinoid to another have very different effects. And it's also exciting because they all do have such different effects that when we get to the point where we're able to really look at them, we can really see, oh, well, does CBG do this? Does CBD do that? So I hope that answers the question.
Some people with dementia may forget that they've used it and may request more and more. How do you have any suggestions on how to deal with those cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, what I'm mostly dealing with, for instance, at Inspire, we have nurses who are scrupulous. They have I send in a prescription. They know that it's 2 times a day, 3 times a day at night. So they are being very good about when they give the meds out. If someone is by themselves, that's potentially an issue. If they have caregivers there, they can certainly be monitoring it. But it is a potential issue that somebody, but again, people might fall asleep, if they take too much of it. In many ways, it's not really that harmful. So.
Okay. And I just want to let the listeners know that they could always call our helpline. We may be able to provide you with some tips for distraction or redirection if needed. Okay, we have a couple more. I just want to remind people that we are going to send out the slides tomorrow morning, along with a feedback survey. Is vaping as harmful as smoking?
When you smoke, there are all kinds of tars and other hydrocarbons that are released, and there's a lot of heat. The nice thing about vaping is that it is what you have is an oil, and there's a very precise temperature at which that oil becomes a vapor. It's vaporized. So there is much less harm to vaping than to smoking.
And does the form of cannabis one takes determine its efficacy? Smoking, eating, injecting?
It can. I mean, what's fascinating about it is that I hope at some point we will be able to look at somebody's genotype, let's say, and say, okay, well, you should try these different types of medicine, of cannabis products for your X, Y, or Z. In fact, I was on Ancestry.com, I think. They actually sent me something that said, oh, by your genetic profile, you should try these different products for your depression or back pain. It's completely bogus. One day we may be able to get there, but what I tell people, it's impossible to really tell how people are going to respond. I mean, I see a lot of patients with, for example, inflammatory bowel disease. And because that's an inflammatory process, my feeling was early on, most of them are going to want something that is more CBD than THC. And yet I have a number of patients who, when they get a flare, they do a high THC vape, and it just knocks it down. So I tell people, there's going to be a lot of trial and error. Just be patient, take notes. There is a consistency to it, and gradually build up your toolkit of different products. But it's going to be, everybody responds very, very differently.
Does cannabis assist in detoxifying the body of heavy metal poisons like aluminum?
No, but I can tell you that hemp detoxifies the earth. When they had, when the Chernobyl accident occurred, they planted hemp throughout that area because it's a super accumulator. It takes up everything from the soil and the air. That's, again, I hadn't mentioned this. One of the reasons I'm so happy about the medical program in New York, because I know that the Wadsworth lab up here in Albany looks at every batch and is looking for heavy metals and toxins and things like that. But I have not heard that it's used in the body to eliminate. That's a good question. I haven't seen anything about it.
Okay, next question. Can you explain a bit more about cannabis oil and how it's applied and absorbed?
Well, the oil is generally used, it could be in the vape, or it's used as an oil that you can either put into a drink or into food or put under your tongue. And then there's a topical I'm not sure if the person is thinking about that, but there are oils that are used topically as well.
Where can we get the interaction info if we can't get support from a local doc and have to do this on our own?
Interactions?
Information about interactions.
Oh, there are plenty of places. I mean, you can also talk to me, come to Cannabis Doctors of New York, and I will talk about it. There is plenty of information online looking at drug interactions. I often use the Google for that myself.
Interesting question. Can cannabis use any evidence for cannabis use causing dementia?
It's controversial, and I think that certainly I know some of my colleagues may feel differently. I'm wary of using it in younger people. I mean, it's used a lot for certain things like seizures, for example, but I think heavy use, and especially some of the really heavy concentrated products used by younger people, can cause problems with cognition, can cause issues. I think that's an issue. I think it's a valid question and a valid concern.
This may be the last one. Do THC and CBD have the same effects? And if not, what's the difference?
Right, no, they have very different effects. CBD does not really generally have any psychoactive effects. And oftentimes it can be used to calm the psychoactive effects of THC. THC is fascinating because it has so many effects. I didn't mention a lot of them. It's great for muscle spasticity. I see a lot of cancer patients where it's very helpful for nausea or for increasing appetite. And interestingly, even though it's really distinction without a difference, people talk about sativa and indica, which are THC predominant strains. Sativa is energizing. Sativa or indica, couch. People use it for sleep at night. But CBD, THC doesn't have great anti-inflammatory properties. CBD does. CBD is an anxiolytic. They're very, very different. And yet, if you saw that slide and you looked at the structures, they're almost identical.
Great. I hope we got to most of the questions. I want to thank Dr. Weinberg's team for answering some of the questions in the chat. Dr. Weinberg, there was a question about advocacy. Can you give any advice on how people can be advocates for the use of cannabis for people with dementia?
Yeah, it's funny because one of the things I forgot to mention was that the most recent studies that I've seen show that only 10% of medical schools in the country teach about the endocannabinoid system. So we all need to be talking to our doctors. I have been for years talking to politicians and legislators about it. I mean, and even I think the stigma needs to be overcome. I often, when I talk to my patients in follow-up, I ask, oh, it's doing great for you. Do you tell people about it? Do you feel comfortable talking to your neighbors, to your family, to your friends about it? I think that's really important. But I think the politicians are the important people, and my colleagues who little by little are starting to come around.
And what's the best way for physicians and healthcare professionals to get educated on use and prescribing?
There are a number of courses that they can take online that are very, very helpful. There are a lot of conferences. As I said, Colorado State it's now, unfortunately, it's virtual because it was great to go out there and you know how conferences are and to be able to interact with colleagues and see what they're doing. But Colorado State at Pueblo has great conferences. There are a lot of conferences, international. I was at one a few years ago in Berlin that was really fabulous, a 3-day conference. So people should look, and certainly they can get in touch with me. And there's also the Society of Cannabis, the CSC, I'm blocking on it now. There are a number of societies that are very helpful as well, that you can partake in and that are offering education all the time. The Society of Cannabis Clinicians, excuse me, I think is a great one that I would recommend people joining.
So I want to thank you again, Dr. Weinberg, for your excellent presentation tonight. I just have to do our usual disclaimer. The views and opinions of our presenters do not necessarily represent those of Caring Kind. We're here to give you the latest information about latest topics. Someone asked if this presentation will be available for later viewing. Yes, we do plan to put it on our YouTube channel, and I believe Ken, you are planning to do the same.
Yes, and if you go to my site, which is www.cdony, which stands for Cannabis Doctors of New York.com, it will be there along with a lot of other information.
Okay, thanks again. Good night, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Ed. This was great. I appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
Good night, everyone.